Alright, here we are again. Alright, the usual caveat. This is just a practice stream in order for me to get used to talking into a mic, so you probably don't want to watch this because it's going to be nonsensical and rambling. But if any of you do end up watching this, this fucking goddamn episode is going to be about the the recent ruling out of the federal court in Texas, part of the Fifth Circuit, which basically found the individual mandate from Obamacare, otherwise known as the Affordable Health Care Act, unconstitutional. And I read the summary briefing, and I read like the various arguments going back and forth, and so here is my uneducated analysis of what was going on. All right, I guess get down to brass tacks. So a federal judge in Texas declares Obamacare unconstitutional, and it declared Obamacare unconstitutional using the same or similar logic that SCOTUS I should clarify, the Supreme Court of the United States, otherwise I just call it SCOTUS in here to save time, in 2012 when a lawsuit was brought by a whole bunch of states trying to get Obamacare, or the Affordable Health Care Act, declared unconstitutional. They brought a case to the courts. The court went all the way up to SCOTUS, and SCOTUS ruled on it, saying, well, SCOTUS said a whole bunch of things, but ultimately what ended up happening is SCOTUS agreed generally that the shared cost aspect, so that's the point, that's the shared cost aspect is basically the thing that makes it so that you either have to buy insurance in order to go into the pool to make the pool bigger so that you can cover the people with pre-existing conditions, or you have to pay a penalty, fee, or tax to the IRS if you do not do so. SCOTUS found that originally that the government can't compel you to pay they can't compel you to pay to get insurance, but if they relabeled their what the legislature in Obamacare called a fee, if they relabel it to tax, that totally works with Congress's capacity to levy taxes, specifically excise taxes. And so, just break it down. SCOTUS said in 2012 that the shared cost aspect of the individual mandate, aka buy health insurance or pay what Congress called a fee to what SCOTUS relabeled a tax, was only constitutional as it applied to the Commerce Clause and as a tax. That the shared cost aspect of the individual mandate were separate but related parts of the legislation, and that while government forcing you to buy something is unconstitutional, a tax is not. So basically, Chief Justice John Roberts reworked the Affordable Health Care Act legislation in order to call it a tax and then let the majority, so a 5-4 vote as usual, rule it constitutional. Obamacare itself was passed in 2010, and the Democrat-led Congress that passed it, of course, you know, that's the infamous soundbite where Crypt Keeper Nancy Pelosi said, "We have to pass it to see what's in it." That's where that comes from, because it was 900 pages long. It was a big, complicated mess full of not only legalese, but healthcare insurance variety legalese, which is just fucking like speaking Greek. It's ridiculous. But in that case, both SCOTUS and Congress in 2010 said that the shared cost aspect of the individual mandate were necessary to fund and hold the whole thing together. So the legislation hinged on being able to fund itself, and the only way it was capable of funding itself is either by getting people that were otherwise healthy and probably wouldn't be paying too much into healthcare insurance to get it, or to face a penalty or tax if they did not, in order to basically fund the rest. So it's one part social engineering to try to force people into going into the market so that they can, so that the costs of pre-existing condition and all of their medical bills, all those people, can be offset by the people that are not using their health care but still have to pay into it, or a tax which, you know, funds other aspects of government. So basically, you can't have the Affordable Health Care Act without both the shared cost and the individual mandate. All right, moving on. I'm gonna skip. Come on, work, fucker. All right, this fella is Judge Reed O'Connor. He was a Bush appointee, and he serves on the federal court in Texas, which is part of the Fifth Circuit. This is the judge that made the most recent ruling and noted the discrepancy in the SCOTUS decision, which said that the shared cost aspect of the individual mandate could only be constitutional if it was a tax and part of Congress's power to legislate excise taxes. which in 2017, with the new Republican Congress, they weren't able to pass a repeal and replace Obamacare Act because that cocksucker McCain decided to vote with the Democrats. Which actually, in my opinion, was totally fine, because I don't want Obamacare to be replaced, because whatever you replace it with, it's going to do the same exact fucking thing. I think it should just be totally gotten rid of. And there should be private manipulations worked out in order to make it so that you can cover the cost of pre-existing conditions, which will make it so that the general cost of healthcare will go down so that they can actually be afforded. And for those that can't afford it, then you can just go on the dog shit that is Medicaid. But anyway, I'm sorry, in 2017, Congress removed the enforcement capability. So basically, they told the IRS that they could no longer collect the shared cost portion of the individual mandate. They put passed the very famous Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which not only cut taxes, marginal tax rates for the corporate tax, and it cut it a little bit for individual income taxes. But what it also did is it got rid of the individual mandate or shared cost aspect of Obamacare. With the removal of that provision and recognizing that Congress and SCOTUS ruled the shared cost separate from the individual mandate, the plaintiffs in the case, which were the case that this Reed O'Connor fella ruled on, which were 2 individuals and 20 states, they sued the federal government, including Health and Human Services and the IRS, along with 16 other states on the federal pro-Obamacare side, and the District of Columbia, of course, because that place is fucking dog shit, on the grounds that the removal of the individual mandate collection now made the whole ACA unconstitutional. I'm gonna go back to the fucking stupid graphic I found for that. Fuck you, Affordable Healthcare Act. But anyway, this O'Connor guy, the summary brief, so basically where he explains the position, he explains the case, he explains the plaintiffs and defendants situation, then he goes into a bunch of different kinds of legal precedences. It goes to about 55 pages. So it's pretty long, but it's actually pretty well thought out, researched, and applied. O'Connor cited a number of legal precedents in confirming the standing, and in confirming that the plaintiffs had standing, because in order to sue, of course, you have to have standing to say this is hurting me or something that I'm doing in some way so that I want to be able to redress grievances by suing in the court. If you don't have standing, the court throws your case out. And O'Connor made his ultimate ruling, which was that since the shared cost of the individual mandate was legislatively and legally distinct from one another, and that the funding avenue was removed in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act legislation, the individual mandate could no longer be rolled a tax as it collected no revenue. So since they threw out the IRS's capacity to collect that, it's not collecting revenue. And according to the way the Constitution works and the way that the expanded U.S. Code works, is you have to be collecting revenue on this thing in order for it to be a tax. If it's not collecting revenue, it is no longer a tax. And that's what the plaintiffs, the 20 states and the 2 individuals, sued for. O'Connor further went on to explain the inseverable precedent, which suggested that if Congress and the courts ruled aspects of the bills inseparable from the whole bill, so in this case ruled the shared cost and the individual mandate, it's a separate portion of the whole Affordable Health Care Act bill, but if you rule that aspect of it unconstitutional, then you have to throw the whole thing out, because otherwise, you'll be doing what SCOTUS did initially and what so many other fucking dogshit courts have done, which is legislate from the bench by rewriting legislation to make it work with whatever they think judicial review will allow. But that's not supposed to be what the courts are doing. In the Federalist Papers, the Hamilton and Madison specifically said judges should only be allowed to serve in cases of good behavior, and that explicitly implies that they're not making law, they're just interpreting it. Anyway, so that inseverable precedent would suggest that if Congress or the courts ruled aspects of bills inseparable from the whole bill, when you ruled some part of it illegal, you had to throw the whole thing out or risk legislating from the bench. So since they got rid of the individual mandate in 2017, or more accurately, the shared cost portion of it, which required that you either bought medical insurance or paid that stupid fucking tax, it was removed and declared inseverable from the ACA, which meant that it was no longer being funded, that the whole bill had to go as SCOTUS and Congress said it hinged on the tax fee to fund itself. The judge ruled the whole thing was unconstitutional because it was no longer funding itself. This is an interesting tactic because basically no one saw it coming. Since SCOTUS ruled on the Affordable Health Care Act already, judges usually are very hesitant to take up the issue again, as SCOTUS already said what's what in regards to it. This judge did, though. Go back to his picture. Not Roberts, you fucking cheap sellout cocksucker. This fucking O'Connor guy. Oh, there you go. This judge did, though, and he used the same logic and argument that SCOTUS used to declare the Affordable Health Care Act constitutional in the first place, which they did by legislating or rewriting the bill directly from the bench in order to throw it out. Since SCOTUS ruled on it that way, this judge took the same logic and concluded that since the SCOTUS and congressional logic said individual mandate was what held the bill together because of the Constitution grants Congress the power to tax, that could be removed since it was no longer taxing, and that it had to be removed because its single and sole reason for existing, as per the SCOTUS decision, was that Congress can tax you if they want. So basically, Congress and the Supreme Court, in writing this bill and then rewriting it as fucking Roberts did, said that the whole bill it hinged on that individual mandate and that shared cost in order to make it so that insurance companies could afford to pay for people with pre-existing conditions by either, well, as I said before, either by getting everybody involved into it so there's a much bigger pool with which they can pull money out for them, or by taxing them to try to encourage them to buy health insurance, or just to pay a penalty if they didn't. So this Judge O'Connor fella constructed a very complex and well thought out and very well argued decision that SCOTUS will have to have a hard time denying or overturning. Since he used SCOTUS's specific arguments and logic, the Supreme Court, in order to overturn this, will have to really pull some serious mental gymnastics right out of their ass. That will be especially difficult and will probably shine a very bright light on the gymnastics immediately because this ruling uses their logic, which was already set in precedent. So this judge basically used an intelligent argument to pull a judicial checkmate on SCOTUS, which means if they hear it and continue with the logic they used initially to okay the ACA, they will have to agree with his decision or make up new nonsensical arguments which will be easy to deride and criticize, and which Congress can probably just completely crush if, they ever have any balls. The ruling and all that was long and complicated, and there's no real reason to go into it past the things that I said. But I will show you the conclusion from the document. And the conclusion says, for the reasons stated above, the court grants plaintiffs partial summary judgment and declares the individual mandate unconstitutional. Further, the court declares the remaining provisions of the ACA are inseverable and therefore invalid. The court grants plaintiffs' claim for declaratory relief in count 1 of the amended complaint. So that was just the conclusion of his ruling, going through all of his rationale, the history, the precedents, and all that to come to the conclusion. And I think it was a rational logical conclusion, and I really don't see how SCOTUS is going to find the way around it, but I guess that's the whole point of lawyers. It's you pay them to find ridiculous nonsense to get around things that you don't like. But the other interesting thing about this is this was the rare instance of a court avoiding legislating from the bench and using logic from a previous court created in order to specifically legislate from the bench. Also, it's an instance of the federal government depowering itself by removing a nonsensical bill and SCOTUS ruling with logic and common sense as induced by law and judicial review. It's a very rare circumstance of where the federal government shrinks itself of its own accord instead of always growing in perpetuity. This was a very interesting outcome and an amazing reversal of a century-long trend. However, all in all, Obamacare will remain intact as it is until the decision goes through the appeals courts and possibly makes its way back to SCOTUS. So this decision could be reversed at any time, and you can bet the vast powers within the federal government will no doubt pull out every stop, legal, ethical, constitutional, and unconstitutional, to reverse this ruling. It'll definitely be worth paying attention to this as it moves forward, just because, but not only is this kind of a new thing, but it's going to probably set the template for how you override judicial activism and dogshit nonsensical, completely unconstitutional bills that Congress shits out its ass because they're a bunch of corrupt fucking idiots. Where it'll go, nobody knows, but hopefully it goes somewhere, and hopefully it starts to work the way that it was intended to initially, when the goddamn founders decided that they were tired of a ruling elite that did nothing to ever redress grievances from the people, or revolt against it, and then make their own based on the ideas of Locke and Montesquieu and a few others, where the government is there to protect liberty rather than to corral or control its subjects. I wouldn't hold my breath too hard or too long or too well on this actually going anywhere, because the entire apparatus of the federal government seems to be specifically set against it. And likewise, as the founders talked about many times, and as just history itself will show you, eventually all governments become autocratic. Eventually, the proportion of corruption, which hopefully starts out with a small proportion of corruption, because statistically there's going to be some corruption if you have a big organization with more than 1,000 people in it. But as time rolls on, that proportion of corruption, of course, grows, and when money and power is involved, it grows much, much faster than it would if not. So it seems to be that in order that the federal government became autocratic because it decided that, well, not it, of course, it's a big organization, but by the general nature of corruption and time and old organizations, it accrued all the money and power it could in order to autocratize and basically just continue running itself as itself. It's no longer serving the people, of course. It doesn't give a rat's ass about the Constitution. It pisses on shits all over it every fucking day. It basically just prints money in order to waste further tax revenues it can be getting in order to buy votes from weak, dumb people, or get involved in make a bunch of useless, pointless laws in order to keep themselves busy, or engage in a bunch of useless, fucking pointless wars in order to make their foreign partners, which governments are doing the same exact thing, happy. It's a shitty and unfortunate set of situation and set of circumstances, but it is what it is, and you just have to deal with what it is. This is the first instance, though, that I can remember in a while, where government has said, oh, no, we're going to start shrinking ourselves because this rule that we put through, which gives us control of 1/6 of the U.S. economy via healthcare, is unconstitutional dog shit and ought to be thrown out under its own ridiculous merits. And I suppose that really is all there is to say about that. Otherwise, things that are going on. I guess we can jump into Paris a little bit. All right, so the Paris riots, everybody knows a little bit about what's going on, but of course, as usual, the mainstream dogshit controlled leftist dominant establishment mass media is ignoring it, or when they do talk about it, are trying to spin it into something that it's not. There's actually been a lot of headway with this yellow vest movement, which of course rose up basically just to tell the French government to go fuck itself and to demonstrate that they're tired of putting up with their goddamn useless bullshit. It's a big umbrella thing, so there's a whole bunch of different little more individual and varying reasons for why a bunch of different people are in it. But since it's a big group and everybody that is involved in it will do their own thing, then it'll go a bunch of different ways. Now, of course, they were successful getting the gas tax, which was the straw that broke the camel's back and caused them to begin the uprising to begin with. They had that temporarily reduced, but as I said before, it'll probably come back in 6 months with just a 20% reduction in how much they tax, but I'm sure it'll come back. But since that was successful, they keep going. Likewise, the same people that have been demonstrating for 5 weeks pretty much straight have gotten another concession from the French government, which is they were able to get the minimum wage raised, which is an unfortunate and very stupid portion of what's going on here. And of course, whenever you have any popular uprising movement, especially one where the commies, like these cocksuckers in this picture, can use it as cover in order to go do their dumb commie shit, eventually it'll be taken over by retarded populists that want to basically just... As with any circumstance of democracy, they want to make it so that two wolves and a lamb are voting on what's for dinner. And in this case, since they got what they wanted with the gas tax, which was actually hurting the working class type people, now they want to raise minimum wage, and they got that, which of course will make everything fucking ridiculous and stupid, because the minimum wage just makes it so that employers have to pay their employees more, but then they hire less employees, they work them less often, which in France I think their work week is only 30 hours anyway, from a similar set of these kinds of revolts coming from the 60s and the 80s. So basically, they'll price themselves out of their own market and once again use the Hegelian dialectic to have government try to come in and fix everything. So that's stupid, but it was, of course, always going to be stupid, and of course, eventually it was going to be hijacked by these dumb populist cocksuckers that want to just ruin their country without the capacity to think forward and realize that the stuff that they're doing will actually fuck themselves in the long run. But it's typical of humans, especially collectivists, culturally collectivist types like these French cocksuckers. So their movement is being hijacked and wants to also do the usual free crap. So they want more taxpayer money for college, more taxpayer money for benefits, more taxpayer money for all the usual stupid crap that's just going to waste it, and give the government that they're pissed off at to begin with more power to control their lives from cradle to grave. But that something is happening is probably what's most important here, and that something happens. Hopefully, the people in this movement that's on the other side of the social populace that just want the government to leave them the fuck alone can rise up against those cocksuckers too, and get start either getting those stupid things changed or just saying, all right, the government, it's time to just leave us the fuck alone, get out of here. And when these little fucking stupid commie cocksuckers decide to rise up and start something, just crush them down under their fucking under their fucking feet. There's actually a lot more to say to that about that, but I'll probably just save that for an actual stream when I can go in depth and start talking about it. So I guess now we will move on to Brexit. And of course, something else that's been in the news a lot lately, especially the international news, because of course Brexit is not America, is Britain in basically the people of Britain, just like the yellow shirts or the yellow vests, are tired of the EU, and particularly the elitist communist cocksuckers that run their government, of pissing away all their sovereignty and just letting the European elitists with their banking cartel pals just dictate how everything in the country works. So, of course, they had a popular referendum, a binding referendum, where they voted to get out of the EU, and ever since then, the political establishment has been dragging its feet as hard as it can in order to avoid this or delay it. But this Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been unable to do so, so she did put forth a quote-unquote deal with EU, which has yet to be voted on in their parliament. But basically, what the British people seemed to want when they voted for Brexit was get out of the EU, so the EU would no longer have any specific control over them. They could still have aspect to us portions of the market, but without the oversight of the EU telling them what they can and can't buy. And likewise, immigration, filling immigration quotas and telling the British people what they have to do in their own goddamn sovereign country. This May lady negotiated a deal with Brussels, which is where the center of the bureaucratic state of the EU is centered, and made a deal which the British people can find to be complete dog shit, because though it does get them out of the EU in name, they still are going to be under the same specific restrictions of the common single market that the EU was initially created to make. So they're not going to get any national sovereignty coming back as it applies to their markets and how they deal with the EU. Likewise, they're going to have to still pay the EU a bunch of money, and they're just basically going to lose whatever minuscule vote they have in the EU Parliament. So they're still basically going to be a part of the EU, but they're going to be a vassal state where they get no say in it, and nothing will really change. That pissed off a pretty fair amount of the people of not only the British Parliament, but just the people in general, and a lot of people are calling for this lady's head. The boss of bosses, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is another Conservative MP, seemed to utilize this growing anger towards May and the political establishment, even among his party, in order to try to set forth a vote of no confidence for Theresa May, which would effectively remove her from the Prime Minister seat and then give it to somebody else. Unfortunately, she was able to rally the Conservatives around her, and they did not go through. They did vote for they did take the no confidence vote, but they did not vote for no confidence. So May will remain the leader, and basically now nothing is stopping the Parliament from voting for her dogshit deal and quote-unquote leaving the EU, which really just makes it so the EU still isn't exactly the amount of control they are, except for Britain has absolutely no say in what's going on anymore, and Britain has to pay more money to remain in that same fucking situation. Now, it's a damn shame that they didn't vote for no confidence to get